Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort, and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those.
I am so glad you decided to join me today on my podcast.
How many times
Nicholas,
have you
thank
been
you so
sharing a
much.
story only
I'm
to
here
be
today with
interrupted by a
Nicholas Rupp
person
out
eager
of
to
Salt
share
Lake
his
City.
own?
And
When I'm working
I
with
met
clients
him
on
through
communication skills,
a
I remind
post
them to
on
listen for
Facebook,
understanding,
and a
not
few
to
of my friends had
respond.
shared it or had
But during this
commented on it,
podcast, I'm
and his
asking you to
story just
listen and
completely
consider your own
took
related
me
stories.
to a
To
totally different
listen
place
and
than I thought
consider
he was
which
going
stories in
with
your
it.
life
And
might have
usually when I read a
impacted you in a
story,
similar way.
I can predict where it's going. And this one was just so well written and such a beautiful, spontaneous decision that I had to reach out to him. And now he's agreed to be on the podcast and share a little bit of that story here. But even more importantly, I get to hear more about the leading up to that story, which is what I always like to dig into. So Nicholas, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, Sarah. You're very kind to say such nice things about the post.
Well, and now that I know you, I could say nice things about you as well, but we'll dig into that later in the podcast.
Okay.
So the first thing I always do is I ask my guests to share something about themselves that most people probably don't know. And the reason I do that is I like our listeners to get a little glimpse into who the guest is as a human being behind the stories that we're going to end up digging into later on in the podcast. So what do you think?
So I'm an only child, and growing up, I preferred the company of animals to humans. Now, I don't think that is particularly unknown among people who know me, or unusual, but I had a chinchilla, was one of the pets I had, which at the time, I think they're probably a little more common as pets nowadays, but we're talking almost 20 years ago or more. And chinchillas were a pretty rare pet to have. And that was one of my favorite pets that I had growing up.
A chinchilla. What other pets did you have growing up?
I had the typical like gerbils, hamsters, pet mice, dogs, cats, all of that. But the chinchilla really stands out.
That's really funny. And you shared something with me before we hit the record button that made me laugh about your hobby.
My hobby, yes. So I work a lot. I spend a lot of time at work at the Salt Lake County Health Department. So people often ask me, well, what do you do to relax? What's your hobby? And I honestly have to say, I don't really have a hobby. And I would tell that to people over and over. And I'd feel so boring. And they'd say, well, what do you do when you get home to unwind and relax and spend your free time? What gives you pleasure and what you enjoy? And I realized my hobby is cleaning the house or cleaning up after dogs, or like, I just love cleaning things, which makes me feel a little bit nerdy and uncool, but cleanliness is good.
I just think that's so funny. And I don't know you that well, so there's nothing that could really surprise me about that, except that when I was asking you to share something about yourself that people might not know, the fact that you had pets as a kid and that you have how many dogs in your house right now?
Well, right now I only have 2, but for most of my adult life with my husband, Michael, we had 4 dogs. So, and we were a 4-dog household year after year after year.
So usually people who are all about cleanliness really struggle with having pets, right? Isn't that a kind of a common thing?
Yeah, I think that is very common, but I am pets first, cleanliness second. As cleanliness is as important as that is to me, the dogs and their well-being come first. Now, part of dog well-being is great hygiene, good grooming, and lots of boundaries and structure and rules. I mean, dogs do very, very well with structure. So when you implement that structure and the behavior training and all of that really well, the house does stay pretty clean.
Well, that actually makes a lot of sense. And what strikes me about this whole conversation is that it's not that you're cleaning because cleanliness is so important to you. You're actually cleaning because it's something you enjoy doing. And I think those are two different things.
I think they are different things. And it's funny, when my husband and I were first dating and getting to know each other, he was not particularly tidy. And, you meet people and you fall in love with them and you find those things that are negotiable and the things that are not negotiable. Tidiness was not negotiable for me. Like I am a personality that really needed to have some order in my living space in order to function at my best. And Michael, he became a tidier person for me. And that was one of the ways that I knew we were a good relationship, because he was willing to change himself to a degree to make me more comfortable. And I found the ways that I could change myself to make him more comfortable and just improve both of us.
Right. So you were able to compromise a little bit on the cleanliness to a point where you could both be not freaking out over a mess.
I may have decreased my standards just a little bit. And he rose to them. I mean, he is so tidy now.
Does he like it?
He does. In fact, shortly after we started living together, moved in together, and I was always cleaning and tidying up, and he started getting into the habit as well. One day he said, "It's really nice to be able to invite people over and just have them come and not have to panic and get things ready and clean up a space for them to be in and all of that. It just it kind of exists and they can just show up." And I said, "Yeah, it's nice."
This sounds so familiar. These are exactly the conversations I had with my husband 20 years ago.
And Michael's so good now that when I have a very stressful day and we've dealt with something at work that is causing me anxiety, I'll come home and he'll have the cleaning supplies out, or he will have begun cleaning already, knowing that I'm going to need to go home and clean to feel better.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. But I don't think that's so terribly unusual to find that methodical organizing and cleaning to be kind of an activity that clears your head.
I think that's true. I think creating order and tidiness in your physical space helps bring order and calm to a chaotic mind.
That is exactly what my husband said when we first started dating, and I would walk into the apartment and I'd dump my stuff on the dining room table. And he'd be like, "Can you please not do that?" But that's what he said. He said the clutter and disorderliness makes my brain feel cluttered. Yeah. And I have trouble focusing.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And cleaning one cleans the other.
And what's funny is that when I get angry, if I'm like in a mood and I'm trying to not be, I'll actually like go over and clean out the Tupperware cabinet or pull everything out of the silverware drawer and clean it. And it's not because I love cleaning. It's because that exactly what you said is that it really takes that kind of activity to get to a point where you feel like you're in some sort of control.
Yeah, you're changing your mental space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. That is not at all where I thought this conversation was going to go. So again, you've pleasantly surprised me. I love this. So let's get back into the meat of the podcast. And the reason that I asked you to be part of this is not only because I read that story and I reached out to you, but then you confirmed that this was going to be a good conversation when you responded. So I wrote a message and said, "Hey, I do this podcast. I think what you said was really important and I'd love to share that story." So I said that my theme was going to be something about those spontaneous things that we do that end up being major pivot points in our lives. And you wrote back how funny you thought that was because you're not usually a spontaneous person.
Right.
And you were surprised at how much this changed. And it wasn't just the fact that you got married. It was that this changed how you viewed things. It really was a pivot point in your life. And at the time, you couldn't have known that.
No, it's absolutely true. I am the least spontaneous person you will ever meet. I don't like surprises in any form, any context. I actually threw Michael a surprise birthday party this year, and he loved it. And he said, "Do you want a surprise at some point?" And I said, "You know better." Like, absolutely not. I hate surprises. I mean, I have to go to the grocery store on the way home from work tonight. And here we are 2 hours before I'm going to even leave. And I know the route I'm going to take to drive to the grocery store. Like, I plan everything.
That's
so spontaneity is not my strong suit. It's not something I'm comfortable with. So getting married spontaneously was kind of insane.
That's huge. So that's something that I talk about a lot in terms of my life and the decisions that I make, because I can appear to be kind of impulsive. And when I was younger, it was worse. But what I'm realizing now, I recently became a certified strengths coach through Gallup. And what's interesting about it is that, well, none of the top 5 strengths that I showed in my assessment were surprising to me.
Okay.
But what it did tell me was that what I do that appears to be impulsive and spontaneous may not actually be impulsive and spontaneous, because just like you, I have a pretty strategic mind.
Mm.
So most of what has gone into that decision already happened in my head. I just didn't acknowledge it because it wasn't necessarily intentional.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, and you had the ring. You had already purchased a ring. That was a part of the story that struck me. Like, he thinks he's not spontaneous, and maybe he isn't, but that wasn't necessarily a spontaneous decision. So let's back up.
Sure.
And just kind of tell the story of what happened that day, and then we'll back up before that.
We don't want the whole story that day, right? That's a long one.
That's a long one. Just the basics, if you could tell it in 2 minutes.
Okay. So I work at the Salt Lake County Government Center, which is where many of the Salt Lake County government offices are. My office is across the hall from the county clerk's office, which is the office that issues marriage licenses. And one day on December 20th, 2013, the Friday before Christmas, my coworker popped into my office and said, "There are gay people getting married across the hall." And I said, "What?" I mean, same-sex marriage was not legal in Utah or throughout most of the country at that point. She said, "Gay people are getting married across the hall." And I repeated, "What?" She said, "Oh my gosh, gay people are getting married across the hall." And I thought, wow, that is unbelievable. And I went out and looked in the hallway, and sure enough, there was a very small line of about 4 couples, what appeared to be same-sex couples, waiting to apply to be married. As I watched, the line grew from those 4 to 25 couples to 50 couples. And pretty soon, the first few couples that received a license came out, and they got married right there on the spot. They were worried about the opportunity ending, the court issuing a stay, preventing this from continuing. And so they were finding whoever they could who was licensed to perform a marriage, a minister of any kind or a judge, to start marrying them. And I called my boyfriend, at the time my boyfriend, Michael, and he works just a few blocks away. And I said, "On your way home from work, you need to stop by my office because there are gay people getting married everywhere. Every 2 to 3 minutes, there would be another wedding and an eruption of cheers throughout that whole floor of the building." I witnessed 20 to 25 weddings just in probably 10 or 15 minutes.
Wow.
So he came over, and we ran into some friends who were in line to get married, and we were just chatting with them. And I had no plans to get married that day. I was enjoying watching everyone celebrate. And because I'm an employee of that government, I had an ID badge on, and I went and printed a stack of applications and handed them out through the line to try to help those folks in line get through faster and get as many people as we possibly could before the office closed for the day.
That's so
And
cool.
as I was handing those out, I heard someone behind me say, "Oh, Governor Herbert, our Utah governor, he is working on getting a stay issued through the courts, so this all stops, and it could just be done any minute." And in that moment, something clicked in my brain, and I thought, oh my gosh, this moment could end and never come back, or it could be years before we have marriage equality nationally, or I mean, this could all go away. I should ask Michael right now, we should do this and get it done while we can, but we haven't really talked about this. But I think he'd say yes. Well, would he say yes? I need to ask him. I didn't say any of that out loud. It was all an internal monologue in my head. Instead, what I did is hand him the stack of applications on the clipboard and say, here, fill this out. And then I disappeared because I had been told, we had all been told in line that we needed to get 2 forms of ID. And we only carry our driver license with us, 1 form of ID. So I went home to get our passports, leaving Michael in line with our friends, wondering, did I just get proposed to? Is what he was thinking.
Poor Michael.
Right. So I go home, which is, a 20, 25-minute drive. And while I'm gone, Michael gets up to the front of the line because he's just standing in line with our friends, and he has to let people in front of him because we're clearly not ready because he doesn't have someone to marry. And he had to put up with all these jokes of people asking him, so did you get left at the altar? Do you have a runaway bride? And he honestly was answering, I don't know, maybe.
Oh no.
I did finally get back to the county office, and with our passports that we ended up not needing, 1 form of ID, strangely enough, was enough. And I filled out my form of the application because he had done as instructed and filled out the application. We turned it in, and the clerk there accepted it, and she said, I'm going to go put this in the computer. I'll be right back. So she left us alone at the counter, and Michael turned to me and he said, are we going to talk about this? Because we had still never discussed the fact that we were getting married. I had just said, here, fill this out. He filled out the form, and there we were. So when I'd gone home to get our passports, our other forms of ID, I had grabbed 2 rings that I had purchased 4 months before because I had been planning to propose to him on Christmas. That was his Christmas gift that year, was to give him those rings for Christmas. And I pulled out the rings and I said, Judge Shelby bumped up my timeline by 5 days, but will you marry me? And Michael's jaw dropped, and he did say yes, fortunately. And I honestly think he may not have gone through with it if I hadn't had those rings, because he was worried that I was trying to take advantage of this historic moment because it was a historic moment, not because I wanted to marry him. But he saw that I had been planning this for months and months and months, not spontaneous at all. I had just planned to do it in a different way on Christmas Day. The spontaneity, I guess, came in when, well, it's suddenly an option to be legal and not just have it be symbolic in Utah, thanks to Judge Shelby. So let's take advantage of that, and I'll propose here in the hallway and go from there. We got our license. We walked outside of the clerk's office, and we needed to find someone to marry us. And all the judges around were busy marrying other people. And I noticed a woman who happened to be our neighbor, and she runs a small church out of her home. And so she's a minister, and she can marry people. And she offered to do so. And so that's how we got married, in front of the ladies' room at my office, rather spontaneously.
Wow. I just love that story. There were 3 times that I could feel chills up my spine. 3 different times when you talked about, at first there were 4 couples, and then there were 25 couples, and then there were 50 couples. I ended up immediately getting this just complete chill up my spine because it is pivotal. I mean, that's a huge thing. And maybe you wouldn't have done that had the risk not been there in terms of the governor trying to place a stay on it to keep people from continuing that. Maybe you wouldn't have. But there was nothing spontaneous about it other than the timing.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. And I think, for everyone there that night, the clerk's office closed. This all happened between 3 and 5 p.m. And the clerk's office closes at 5. And when 5 o'clock rolled around, there were over 100 couples in line. And to their credit, the clerk's staff volunteered unanimously to stay late the Friday before Christmas and process everyone who was in line by 5 p.m. And unfortunately, there were a few people who arrived even after 5 that had to be told to wait until the following Monday. But I thought that was really wonderful of the clerk's office staff to do that. But to see that line grow from 4 to 25 to 50, and then ultimately to over 100 people, that was amazing. I mean, the word in the community spread so quickly. I was getting text messages just right and left, ding, 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 of people saying, are you going to the county building? Are you still at the county building? Are you meeting so-and-so there? And we saw friends and neighbors and family, just so many people. And not just people getting married, but people had invited their family and friends to come witness their weddings, their spontaneous weddings. And so there were entire family reunions happening, and everyone in tears, because it was this moment that we didn't think would happen soon or maybe ever.
Right. Well, it's Utah.
Exactly.
It's a highly conservative state.
I think that's one reason why the nation was surprised that Utah pushed marriage equality forward nationwide.
That is very shocking. I mean, if you know anything about the politics of Utah, that's pretty shocking and awesome.
It's great. I mean, I'm so thrilled that we got to be part of that.
So looking back, we talked about this a little bit before I hit the record button. You said that getting married was a pivotal point in your life, of course. But it was that spontaneous decision and the story that made it a different kind of pivot. So when you think about right after it happened and everybody's crying and you're having a great time, the first time you told the story to somebody, what was that? Do you remember? Is that like a vivid memory?
I don't remember the first time I told the complete story, but I do remember texting people close to me who were not there in the moment saying, hey, we just got married in front of the ladies' room at the government center. And their response, like, what? And most of them had heard that same-sex marriage had suddenly become legal in Utah, but a few didn't even know that. And they were like, what? How is that even possible? What's going on? What happened? I do remember remarking to Michael right after we got married, well, this is going to be a hell of an anniversary story. And thinking of that in a bad way. Like, we didn't get to plan a party. We didn't get to plan a reception. We didn't get to invite all of the people important to our lives. Neither of our parents were there, his or mine. Are we going to regret that? And he, for the first probably 6 to 12 months, kept saying, should we have a party? Should we throw a reception? And we talked about it, and we ultimately decided not to, because we wanted to spend that money in other ways, or have a party for our friends and family that wasn't all about us. That's really not our style. So ultimately, getting married that way really fit us better. And I came to love the story, but I didn't realize it initially, that the story was great and that I'd love telling it. I thought it was interesting and quirky and was kind of fun to mention at parties. Oh, guess how we got married? But it would be in passing and it would take 15 seconds. It wasn't until probably months or even a year later when I cohesively put the whole narrative together in my head about what had occurred that day, what had happened in that timeline. And I recognized how really great it was.
Mm-hmm. And you told me that you wrote it down so you wouldn't forget the details.
Yes, I had never planned to share this with anyone outside our close friends and family. I had told a handful of people who didn't already know how we got married. I had mentioned, oh, you got to hear how we got married. And I would tell them, but it was very few. And as our 5th anniversary approached, I was thinking a lot about that afternoon and evening. And I'd struggle a little bit with remembering some of the details. And I thought, I need to write this down, everything I remember, because in 20 more years, I will really have forgotten a lot. And I want to remember some of these things. So I just sat down and typed it out very, very free flowing, and wrote the whole thing down, everything I remembered. And then I probably made 4 or 5 very small edits, and it was done. And I read through it and I thought, this really captures it well. I like this. And I thought, I'm just going to post this on Facebook. Like the few friends I have on Facebook, I mean, I'm in the triple digits, but not a ton. They're going to enjoy hearing some of this recollection because they were either there, they also got married, something like that. So I posted it. And one friend commented that he found it really inspirational and he got a tear in his eye. And this is a friend who is kind of a tough guy.
So not sentimental.
Not at all. The fact that he acknowledged it brought a tear to his eye, I thought was surprising. And he said, "You should consider making this public. I'd love to share it." And I thought, well, sure, why not? Like, that doesn't bother me. I do think it's a cute story. So I made it public. And within about an hour, there were 100 shares. And I was floored. I thought, who are these 100 people who give a damn about how I got married? Like, that is just crazy to me. And I went to bed that night. I woke up the next morning, and we were probably in the 5,000 or 6,000 share range. And 20,000 reactions. I was completely floored.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as you were telling me this virality of that story is that there were other people involved in this story. What did Michael think of it when he read it? I'm sure he read it.
He did. He read it when I posted it just for my friends on Facebook before it was public. And he said, "I read our wedding story. You did a really good job with it," which was sweet.
Yeah, but you didn't give it to him first to get his perspective on it.
No, you know what? Maybe that was selfish. I don't know. I didn't even think about it. I wrote it down for me to remember the details. And I just happened to share it initially with a few people, which including Michael. And frankly, I didn't care if anybody else liked it. It was for me.
Right.
And the fact that he told me you did a really good job with it was really gratifying. But ultimately, that was just a bonus.
So was his perspective any different when he read the story? Did he say, "That's not how I saw it," or, this is what I was doing while you were getting the passports? I mean, add to that.
He told me that it captured his feelings really well, but the part when I wasn't there, when he was just standing in line waiting for me, hopefully to come back, he was going to write down his recollections of that part, the part that wasn't included. And I don't think he's done that yet, but when he does, I will be sure to make it public so others can read.
If he wants that.
If he wants that, of course. He's a writer by trade, so he would absolutely love people to read anything of his writing. Well,
which makes that compliment to you even more valuable. If he's a writer and he said you did a good job capturing that moment.
Yeah, it's wonderful. He's very sweet, so it's in his nature to be just like that.
And supportive, obviously.
Yes.
So what about the other people, your friends that were in the line?
So
was their story similar? I mean, I'm sure there were other stories that were similar, and that's why it resonated so much.
I haven't heard any stories of people who proposed to each other and got married in line. Most of our friends heard the news that marriage was now legal, and they discussed it with each other and then drove to the county building. I have one colleague here at the county government center who got married the Monday following, but she didn't get married that Friday night spontaneously. They had a couple of days to decide to do so. But all of our friends, we had friends who live not far from Salt Lake City who drove into town to get married when they heard it on the news, and they barely made it in the 5 o'clock deadline. They were actually our witnesses for our wedding. But they were so upset that they were wearing their ratty old Friday night clothes of staying home and writing Christmas cards and things like that. Right. But we couldn't plan these things.
I would love to hear from some of them if you ever get an opportunity to ask them, because their stories are probably just as powerful. They're sitting at home, they hear this news, they see all their friends on Facebook, and they're like, we have to go right now. In our ratty clothes that we've been writing Christmas letters on. Because I know that when they showed up, they had that same feeling of spontaneity, even if they had the time to kind of think about it on the drive over or.
Absolutely. People were so rushed to get to the building and get married. They didn't think to call their parents or their children or their other loved ones. There just wasn't time. Right. They just had to do it. We had friends who were planning to get married in Hawaii the following spring, but they dropped everything and came and just did it in Utah.
So what I love about how you took this story was because you and Michael understood that you changed your story midway, because at least you knew the story had changed because you had the rings. You had already planned, and it was just a few days early, but you understood that the dynamics that were at play on that day made your story something special and different, and you embrace that. And I can imagine that some of the other couples still kind of, they question whether it was a good idea, or they still don't see it as part of the beauty of their story. I don't know if there's regret there, but what do you think about that?
There were over 1,000 people who got marriage licenses the following Monday instead of the just slightly over 100 on that Friday night. And someone commented, I don't know how I feel about sharing an anniversary date with 1,000 other people all in this city, 1,000 other couples. We have our two closest couple friends also got married that weekend. And so we always, the six of us, always celebrate our anniversaries together. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I love that our anniversary will always be their anniversary too. And mm-hmm. Our friendship was strong anyway, but we will forever be bonded because,
connected, right?
Yeah, we have that shared anniversary. And I feel that way about other people in that line who I didn't know. And I actually really love this story. On the Sunday of that weekend, our picture was in the newspaper of getting married in front of the ladies' room. And it was part of a collage with 3 other couples also getting married that Friday night. And on Facebook, someone took a photo of the newspaper article with our photos and tagged me in it, and then tagged all of these other couples. Well, I didn't know any of those other couples, but we added each other on Facebook and have since become friends in real life because we shared newspaper photo article together just about all getting married at the same time.
So again, it's about embracing the story rather than fighting it or having some sort of regret over it. And yeah. I can imagine that can be difficult for some people that don't think the way that you and Michael thought about it. And it kind of makes me sad because I think, yeah, you share your anniversary with 1,000 other people. That's cool. I mean, if you think about it that way, it's like, that was a day of serious love and
lots of love. And it's almost like a mass wedding, but they were all individual.
Right. But it's a mass wedding.
What is also really interesting, what was interesting to me is my coworkers. I work right here in the same building where all the weddings took place. And several of my coworkers came by and said, so are you going to get married? And I said, well, no. Because I was going to propose on Christmas Day. So no, of course I wasn't going to get married.
You had a plan, and you're a planner.
I had a whole plan for 5 days later. And then we set a wedding for whenever. And then they saw us on the news getting married, and they were so mad at me. They were so upset that they didn't get to come to the wedding. They still, 5 years later, will give me a hard time about getting married while they were 20 feet away in the other office. And I didn't tell them. And I had to keep reminding them, I didn't have time. I couldn't come get you. We just had to do it. And
there's the reality that they weren't the top priority at that moment.
No, not at
Michael
that moment.
was.
Much to their disappointment. Michael was definitely my priority in that moment.
As it should be.
Yep.
That's beautiful. So tell me, when you were younger, like maybe when you first met Michael or before you met Michael, and you have this idea of what your life is going to be, and you're a planner, so you definitely had kind of that idea. Tell me just one last story before we finish about another pivot moment that maybe even with Michael that you knew he was the one.
Oh boy. Michael and I have such a fantastic relationship. I've been in relationships before this one. And what was striking to me about my time with Michael, even early on, is that there was an immediate sense of mutual respect from the very beginning. We really don't fight about things or argue about things. If we have a disagreement, we discuss it. And I noticed that immediately. And to be perfectly honest, it's all Michael. Like I am not a peacemaker. I'm very forthright and opinionated, and Michael he's just a saint in dealing with my opinionated, bossy self.
So you met, and you're on a date, and you realize this is the case, right? I mean, and I just have to ask because there was a moment when I was with my husband, when we were it was our first date, really. We'd gone out to lunch a couple times and decided just to be friends. And then he picked me up on his motorcycle to go out to dinner and gave me a helmet to wear. And I had a leather jacket. And he took me up. We lived in DC at the time. And he took me up Rock Creek Parkway so we could take the curves. And he took me to this little Italian restaurant, Copi's, on U Street, I think it was. And I remember the moment as I'm looking at him across the table that he looked at me like I really mattered. And it was different from any other person I had ever dated. And we walked back out to his motorcycle for him to drive me home. And I totally attacked him with a kiss, just laid one on him, because I knew at that moment as we're sitting at the table, and I didn't know forever because I had decided a long time before that I was never going to get married. I just knew that this was the real deal and that I felt something that I hadn't felt before with him.
Wow.
So
that's a great story.
He was very romantic. And then he tested me by introducing me to his big yellow lab to see how I would respond to Pudley. And I passed the test.
And you passed the test.
Yes, I squatted down to pet her and snuggle her up. And that's when Bob knew I was going to be okay. But so tell me about that moment with Michael.
You know, I honestly don't remember having that one moment when I knew he was the one. But I do remember at some point thinking, and this was the exact thought, I don't know that anybody else is going to put up with me as well as he does. And I don't remember exactly when that happened, but it was before I decided to, buy rings and make that plan, obviously. Our first date story is a little interesting as well. I had ended a long-term relationship, essentially a divorce, about a year before we met, and I was depressed and I didn't want to date. I didn't want to throw myself back out into that world. And I made a deal with myself that I would go on one first date a month for a year. And if after that year I hadn't found someone I felt like I could at least start to explore building something with, I could give up on myself and my dating life.
Oh,
So 12 first dates that year. And Michael was my 11th. I had 10 first dates and none of them turned into anything worth keeping. And I went on that 11th first date. And by then, I'd done 10 first dates with guys that it just wasn't working. And I was kind of burned out and over the whole first date concept. So we sat down at this restaurant where we'd agreed to meet. We chatted for 10 minutes. And I turned to him and I said, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how's this going? And he just stared at me and blinked. And he said, 9+. I said, okay, then let's have dessert. And he tells that story similarly, although he also adds that he was completely taken aback by me being that forthright and just no
bullshit. Right.
Exactly. I wasn't sure if we could say the word on your podcast.
We're grown-ups.
Perfect. So, no bullshit. That's the word he uses. So he was taken aback for a moment, but then he said, and it was so refreshing because if I wanted to, I could have said, 3, have a nice night, and we would have ended it. So that was our first date. By our third date, I knew I wanted to explore something serious with him. And at the time I had 3 dogs, and Michael was not a dog person. He didn't know I had dogs. We hadn't discussed that part yet. So I was talking to him on the phone and after our second date, and I said, for our third date, why don't you come over? We'll get some dinner. We'll watch a movie, just casual, stay in. You can meet my dogs. And it was quiet on the other end of the phone. And he said,
no.
You have a dog? And I said, I have 3 dogs. And it was quiet again. And then he said, big dogs? And I said, 60, 70, and 80 pounds.
Oh, yeah. My goodness. Those are big dogs.
They are big dogs. And he said, okay. And I could tell, obviously, from how that conversation was going, that he was not loving this. And given it was only about to be our third date, I said, I kind of hear where this is going. Just come over. Let's give it a chance. Meet the dogs, and you can decide if you spend 10 minutes and you think, I cannot deal with these dogs, we'll go out and do something else, have a nice night, and we don't have to pursue this. He agreed. He came over, and I will give my dogs credit. They are exceptionally well behaved. We did the introductions, and he fell in love with the dogs, and ultimately he ended up being their favorite. I mean, he loves them more than me.
Aww. So he recognized that it was worth finding out whether that was going to be a deal breaker.
Oh yeah, he did. And he's so observant and perceptive, especially about people. Mm-hmm. So he really takes his time in observing and analyzing a situation and the individuals around him. And so I think he saw, fortunately, something in me that was worth exploring and checking out all those deal breakers.
It sounds like he is a really empathetic person.
Yes,
absolutely. Definitely senses the emotions of the people around him.
Yeah, he's a social worker as well, so that it makes a lot of sense.
That totally makes sense. Wow. What a great series of stories. Oh, I would encourage you to keep digging into those little mini episodes, not just of your relationship with Michael, but also even pre-Michael, those pivot points with the former relationships. And
there's some doozies there.
Yeah, well, we all have those, right? We all have those. I hope. I mean, otherwise, where's the fun in life if you don't have those weird situations where you can later tell the stories, right? And
I mean, sometimes the only thing you can get out of a terrible situation is the ability to say, well, that's going to make a great story at the very least.
Exactly. And the way I describe it to people that I coach, whether it's a personal relationship or a business relationship, I think it's more important to know your deal breakers than to have a laundry list of the things you want in somebody or a job. I think the deal breaker list should be much shorter.
That's really valuable. Yeah.
Yeah.
To know where your limits are.
Exactly. And they change. It's not like I knew all my deal breakers when I was 25. And even now in my 40s, I still every once in a while will have that boundary hit. Mm-hmm. And I'll realize, oh my gosh, that's a deal breaker. That's not something I can tolerate.
And it's funny, I find that my deal breakers, in some ways, I've become more permissive and I give people more benefit of the doubt, or I'm kinder with people who are struggling, or I feel like I'm a better human being and I'm not as harsh. But in other ways, I'm not going to put up with certain bullshit. Like, that's a deal breaker much sooner than it would have been before. So it's like a weird balance. Does that make sense? And I haven't really classified why or figured out why that is.
I don't think that's unusual, actually. I mean, if you look at really much older people, like in their 90s, and they say what they're going to say.
Right.
And yet most of the people I know in those age ranges, 80s, 90s, really mellowed in those years. Yeah. Because the reality was that life is short and unpredictable. And why would you want to be mean in that situation? But at the same time, right, go ahead.
It's kindness. I think I've grown to be a lot kinder, but that includes kinder to myself. So yes. I'm kinder to other people when I'm able to, but I'm also kinder to myself, and that I'm going to cut it off if it's damaging to me.
Absolutely. And I think as we age, we start to recognize that. And if we're smart, we set those boundaries.
Well, that's I've just discovered something new right now. I could never put that into words, but there we are.
Yay! That's exactly what I love. That's why I do this. I have so much fun with this. And I'd love to see that light in your eye just now. You just sparkled. So I cannot thank you enough, Nicholas, for letting yourself be on this podcast.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. It's so much fun.
The thing is, I really trust my instincts. And when I saw your story and then I looked at your Facebook page, I just knew I needed to know you.
Oh,
but it's not sweet. It's insightful.
It's not just, it's insightful. You're right.
Yeah. And I think it has more to do with the fact that whole aging process where you start to realize the people that you want to surround yourself with. And you make the effort at this age to say, these are people I don't want to spend time with. I can respect them. I can treat them fairly, but I'm not going to spend my time with them. They don't fill me up.
Invest.
Yes, they don't fill me up.
Yeah.
But when I see somebody that I know I could really connect with, and that we could learn from each other, and that is warm and kind, I definitely just reach out. And I'm so glad I did.
I'm glad you did too. I've just had a handful of those many messages asked for some sort of future contact, or would I appear on this or that, and I've only done a couple. You're my second, and by far the most fulfilling.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Well, for our listeners, I will have contact information for Nicholas on the blog post associated with this podcast, and maybe a link to his story if it's posted somewhere. But in the meantime, just great wishes to you and Michael for a lifetime of happiness and marital adventure, because there's no such thing as, happily ever after.
No.
But there is the happily finding the right compromises to live together and find fulfillment. So I think we'll just go with that.
That sounds great. The adventure is the bliss.
Yes, it really is. I mean, even when it's really hard.
Well, thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicholas.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You. How you share them will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.